Hi, Misha here, and not only am I continuing to look at the Starfleet ships from Discovery, in this video you might say I'm doubling down. Let's look at the four nacelle ships we see. We have the USS Buran, the Cardenas Class, and we have the USS Europa, the Nimitz-class. And these are a bit of specialty ships in the fleet, as typically four nacelle ships are. In the real world, designers and filmographers like to throw on extra nacelles just to quickly differentiate from the Enterprise, which is two nacelles. So yeah, we've seen them on and off, and we'll compare it to the fleet eventually. But in the meanwhile, let's look at these two models from Eaglemoss. In universe, we're never given a solid reason why for nacelles. We can speculate and have headcanon. Obviously, it would give good redundancy, good for deep space exploration. Have a backup set. Even though it probably doesn't allow for higher top warp, it might allow for better acceleration or something. I don't know. Again, the real world explanation is pretty straightforward. The Cardenas class is an older design, but not obsolete. And this was, the Buran was commanded by Lorca, either the Prime Universe if it's the USS, or the Mirror Universe if it's the ISS. And again, as I've said, registries really can't give you exact production dates, but this one being in the 14s, we can kind of say it's separate from the Walkers and all that, or the later ones that seem to be in the 16s or the 17s for the Constitutions. In the Eaglemoss magazine, they give a rather ridiculous length of 440 meters. If we do the 2/3 division, that gets us to 293.5, give or take. That actually works quite well because it has it about the same length as a Connie. And since a lot of this will be nacelle sticking out the back, we have, little less internal volume than a Connie would. We have pretty typical features and pretty typical starship layout, but we really don't know much about it. The ones we do know, we've got the USS Jaeger, named after Chuck Yeager. By the way, Cardenas, the class title, that was named after a U.S. Air Force pilot, as most of these are. Most. Anyway, but Jaeger was at the Battle of the Binary Stars and was disabled and boarded. That's where Tyler was captured. Nothing good happened to any of the crew that were captured, and presumably the ship was either destroyed or scuttled or left abandoned like the Shenzhou. But we don't see the Buran there. It doesn't seem to be at the Battle of the Binary Stars. A month or so later, it was taking part in an operation fighting the Klingons. That's when the transporter accident swapped the Lorcas, and then Lorca beamed on to the USS version and self-destructed it, claiming it was to save his crew from Klingon capture. In reality, it was to kind of cover his tracks. One thing I find interesting, and Landry was said to be his first officer, and if you look at the first episodes of season 1, she seems very familiar with Lorca. If so, that means she survived the Buran. Now, if he was a replacement, she would know. But look how she acts in season 1. It's very non-Starfleety. And if Lorca beamed up, rarely do people beam alone. My point is, I wonder if they were actually together and she was the Mirror Universe version. I mean, on screen, this is kind of contradictory later in the season as the writers change. But I have to wonder if originally those two were supposed to be mirror universe, and that explains her behavior. Also, the way she's killed rather brutally. I don't know. Just, and he seemed honestly pretty put out by her death, more so than usual. Food for thought, headcanon-y stuff. Either way, ship was self-destructed, and Lorca would go on to play with the Discovery. Design-wise, layout-wise, it's not just the 4 nacelles that make this interesting. Although I will point out they're the square type, kind of the intermediate in Discovery, with swept-back pylons, much like the USS Gagarin that we see, the Shepard class. One unique feature is the location of the bridge being up front here. That was said to be done by the designers to make it look like an older ship. And it does slightly harken back to older Starfleet ships like the Warp Delta. Some of those did have the bridge in the front. It also has this kind of concave saucer, which is kind of neat. It has this gap here. Not sure what that's supposed to be. And the two-pronged dish deflector is on the underside. I actually like that location. Reminds me of a lot of TOS ships that did not have secondary holes. And we have a pretty harsh step down here. So this looks like this is kind of an engineering section on the bottom side. And then we come back here to a rear and shuttle bay. So this is a cruiser, probably a heavy cruiser, certainly a medium cruiser, probably a deep space vessel because of the multiple nacelles, but maybe one that's only a little bit slightly past its prime, still good, but, a couple of decades out of date. Just saying. That said, sure looks neat, I think. So let's move on. We come to the USS Europa, the Nimitz-class. And this class name's a little different. This is named after Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet in World War II. Again, most of these are named after test pilots, astronauts, or at least Air Force pilots, but I think this one has a naval name because of what it is. This was designed to be a heavy cruiser, perhaps even a battle cruiser if Starfleet would admit it, and to be a command ship or a flagship, meaning it would have additional facilities for a commodore or an admiral and their supporting staff. That meant it would have a crew of about 250 with the staff, which actually fits quite well with this era because the Discovery has 130 some odd, the Shenzhou 150, the Connie 200, so the slightly higher crew would make perfect sense with an admiral on board. It's actually a little bit smaller than the Cardenas Class. The magazine has 383 meters. Okay, 2/3 of that would be 255 and a half. So a little bit bigger, a little bit longer than a Miranda, and a little bit shorter than a Connie. When you consider how compacted the nacelles are, they don't really hang out as much and they a little bit shorter, and how much hull volume's here, plus we have a pod up here. Yeah, I can see that. It's pretty thick in certain areas. So she's kind of a stockier ship, but we still have plenty of internal volume. But we see this ship here, the Europa, being Admiral Brett Henderson's command ship at the Battle of the Binary Stars, and as we all know, it gets mushed And then it too self-destructs. That seems to be kind of the running theme with these foreign nacelle chips. So it seems to be quite durable. But we don't really know much more about it than that. We do see a couple more of the Nimitz in the show, but they're unnamed, just kind of background ships. The Europa was the one, and I'm sure they went with the foreign nacelle system so people could easily ID the Admiral's flagship on screen. But yeah, this was again designed as a flagship. Eventually that role would be kind of given over to the Constitution, and then it in turn would hand that role over to the Excelsior, which I'm not sure it ever really fully gave up. I mean, in theory, it would move on to things like the Galaxy, but I don't know, the Excelsior in some ways still seemed king. Configuration-wise, this one's a little unusual. For one, the quad nacelles are staggered. I'm not saying it looks bad, it's just different. For another, the underside's pretty plain, and there's not much to be seen here. No real big deflector, and I'm not sure where the bridge is on this. Looking in the regular locale, pretty smooth there, nothing in the front. I was wondering maybe if it was in the weapon, what would be normally considered a weapons pod, or perhaps since this was a flagship, they finally got smart and embedded the bridge in the middle of the saucer where it were well protected. Just a funny thought. Has these kind of interesting cutouts here too. I think they're shuttle bays? What do you think? Yeah, it's pretty smooth. Interesting strut systems. It is more compacted, whereas the other one is kind of stretched out and streamlined. But again, for a command ship, you probably want something kind of all together and armored up. And this probably wouldn't be a long-range craft. It'd probably be traveling within the Federation borders because, well, you're keeping admirals on board commanding large fleets. So not so much for exploration. Not this time. Metal saucer, but this one's actually lighter. The Buran is quite a bit heavier. And it is a little bit smaller. So, as always, let's compare to the other four-engined starships. And of course, the most famous of those is this one, the Stargazer, Constellation Class. And of course, this was designed back in the days of real models, and it was designed for a TV show. So basically, they kit bashed two Constitution class kits together. Now, I will point out that these nacelles are slightly offset to each other. The top ones are slightly further forward than the bottom, but we're talking just nths of a degree and not much at all. Of course, this one has two bridges. Fun fact about the Constellation, because of the using the top and bottom halves, or two top halves, excuse me, of a model. Yeah, kind of funny. Yeah, definitely a kit bash, but I think it's still a fan favorite because of being Picard ship. And this was certainly not a flagship. This was a long-range exploration ship, and obviously shares quite a bit in common with our other two from Discovery, just because of what they are. Probably in principle, though, this would be more in line with the Cardenas Class, the Buran there. It's more stretched out, more of an explorer type, if that makes sense. And of course, in universe, this would come later. It's still an old ship, though, in TNG time. Yeah. And speaking of TNG, here's another kit bash. The Cheyenne Class from Best of Both Worlds. Very much another one put together just to be destroyed in the graveyard scene. Galaxy saucer, and then kind of custom-made nacelles, and then they took the Galaxy neck and made these dual pods. Again, we can see a connection with our two Discovery ships, especially the very square nacelle layout and the angled pylons, actually very similar to what's on the Buran. Kind of funny that. We know nothing about this ship. Again, it was not even ever seen complete on screen. It was built and then broken apart and hit with a lighter. But it goes to show you that the 4 nacelle continues. And these are the 2 major ones we see. But just for fun, let's look at 2 others. Of course, I'm talking about the 2 Excelsior study models that had 4 nacelles. This one's a, pretty passable starship with a very, very large engineering section. This one's a pizza cutter or a lollipop. Very long and skinny. Again, just concepts. Actually, this one would be really at home in the Discovery series because it is very flat. And flat's kind of the name of the game for Discovery. Plus the nacelles would probably fit in just fine too. Now I just wanted to compare these. These are technically canon since we saw them on and off, like in starbase scenes in the movies, and also in Wolf 359 as debris, and also in the surplus shipyard and unification. So they pop up from time to time. But yeah, I just thought it'd be fun to kind of compare to our 2 Discovery ships to give some perspective. So final thoughts. Well, these definitely both fit into Discovery, and nothing honestly seems too egregious to me. The Europa is fine. I like the pod, but again, the model is kind of plain, not a whole lot of textural detail, and it's kind of squat. I do like the kind of cantilevered offset nacelles. It's different. It's a little odd. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Nebula, if it has the 2 tiny nacelle pod installed. So, you know what I mean? Kind of the whole squat thing kind of reminds me a bit of a Nebula. It's okay as a design, but I actually sincerely do like the Cardenas design, the Buran. I think what helps it is just how simple it is. Swept pylons, nacelles, saucer, and having the bridge in the front kind of identifies it. This design actually started off as a concept, a proposal for the Walker class, the Shenzhou, which explains the different bridge placement in the real world. The one they went with, it's on the underside, but either way, it seems like with the Shenzhou, they wanted the bridge in a weird place. Fun fact, while we saw the Jaeger in the show, we actually never saw this ship, the USS Buran. We saw the ISS Buran, but never this. Kind of funny. Oh, and I think it goes without saying, I know you know, but this is named after the Soviet space shuttle, Buran, which actually did fly. It went to space. In one of its advancements, it was able to be remote controlled and robot piloted to a much greater extent than the American shuttle. So while it did fly, it flew without a crew. but it never had a crewed flight because right about the time that it was ready, well, first, Mir was kind of sucking up a lot of the budget. Afghanistan was raging. And then, not long after, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell. So, yeah, it never happened. But it could have, and in some ways it was an improvement over the U.S. space shuttle. But I digress. Yeah, I really like this one. The model and the design. And I don't hate this one. But it's certainly not my favorite. Discovery verse or universe or anything. It works. But, yeah. Alrighty, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe and all that fun, good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.